Hi guys, welcome back to the shop. I just wanted to make a quick update video for you about the Duetto engine because after the last video about it, I seemed to get a lot of questions from people who didn't quite understand what was wrong. Now, as I said, this block had a bad line bore where the second main bearing had spun. This bearing shell was stuck to the crank and spinning inside its bearing cap and in the block. And while it did that, it obviously removed metal from the cap and from the block. In this situation, a lot of people, would just throw the block away, but what you really should do is weld up that damaged metal and then reline bore it so it's all good and straight and true, and the bearing clearances will be correct, and the crank will be in its original position. That's so important. Whenever you line bore a block, you should keep the original position of the crank. However, whenever this happened, I imagine back in the 80s when these cars weren't worth anything, somebody decided to just line bore the block out and move the crank up a little bit to remove that damaged metal so that everything would be straight and true again and you wouldn't have to bother with welding it up. The issue with that is that it causes all these knock-on problems. The first and the biggest one is, of course, it caused interference in the top end of the engine. The oil seals were no longer concentric with the crank. The thrust washer faces were also no longer concentric, and a big one was that the transmission was no longer lined up with the back of the engine properly. So what I've done to this block, and I don't really want to get into this in the main build video because this is getting off into the weeds a little bit. I sent this block out to an engine shop who I really trust. They've done lots of really good machining work for me, and they've done all my line boring. They do sort of conrod straightening and fitting small end bearings, and they skim all my cylinder heads and that kind of stuff, and they are very, very good at what they do. And they relined bored it for me, making sure that the crankshaft was completely straight and true and that the flywheel wouldn't be sitting at a funny angle at the back of the block. I gave them the crank with the bearings. They made sure that it was machined in such a way that it would have good bearing tolerances when it was all back together. And so they just cleaned up the line bore that this had already had. But what they did, which was very important, was that they moved the location of the oil seals to be concentric with the crank again, and the thrust washer faces. And then what I did with a friend of mine called Robin, who's a really, really talented engineer, he helped me realign the transmission bell housing with the back of the engine. You can see it has new dowels in here, and that's because we knocked out the old ones and drilled out bigger holes, and once we'd gotten everything concentric, fitted these new dowels to hold everything back in place. So I'm really, really happy with the bottom end of this engine. I think is going to be... It still has a little bit of issues, like the top of the fifth main bearing is a little bit lower than the block here because some metal's been removed from it. So I'm going to have to make up a little gasket to bridge that gap so it doesn't leak oil at the back. But I'm really happy with this block now. On the top end, where the valves were just touching the pistons, what I did was I took the pistons and had them machined down a little bit. You can see all around the edge of the piston, there is a chamfered edge to give a little bit more clearance between the piston at TDC and the cylinder head, because the combustion chambers on this engine are a little bit smaller than the bore. So I didn't want there to be any contact, so I had these machined out. And the inlet pocket on the valve has been machined out. It's almost completely flat, whereas if you look at a standard piston, it's really, really deep and it has the sharp edge, whereas this one has a lot of metal removed. I calculated the total displacement of the bores with these pistons and the displacement inside the cylinder head, the complete volume of everything. And then it was quite a long, complicated process, but we did a compression ratio evaluation of what these new pistons and the new position of the crank and that exact cylinder head would be. And it's come out to be about 9.5 to 1. Which I'm actually quite happy with. The original compression ratio would be 9 to 1, but 9.5 is actually completely workable with what I want this engine to be. So it's not crazy high compression. I said, if it was over 10, then I'd have to machine the top of the pistons off to really bring that ratio down. Obviously, when I assemble it, I'm going to check the clearances for the valves all the way around the piston, but I'm pretty sure these are going to be just what this engine needs. Some people ask why I can't use oversized bearings to move the crank, and the reason I can't do that is that oversized bearings are always oversized on the internal diameter. It's never on the outside diameter. unless you're having custom bearings made. Once you're going down the route of having custom bearings made for your engine to move the crank, at that point you're throwing good money after bad. You know, this isn't a Lamborghini Miura, it's not a Ferrari 250. At that point I would just get a different block. And I do have a Giulia Super 1600 block sitting on the shelf. I do have a 1750 GTV engine that doesn't have a car to go into. So if this doesn't work out and this engine isn't good, and this continues to be an issue, I don't see any reason why it should be an issue. I'm just going to change it for a different engine block, because going and getting thousands of dollars worth of custom engine parts to make this work is just, it just doesn't make sense for this car. I mean, even if it was an Alfa Romeo TZ1 with a matching numbers block, then by all means. But for a Duetto Spider, it's just not worth it, I think. I think at some point you have to draw a line and just say, let's start over. So anyway, so I'm quite happy with the block. So I hope that answered some of your questions about the state of the engine block. The next time you see this, I'll be doing the assembly video. Now we can go and have a look at some stuff on the transmission. For the short while that this transmission was in the car, it leaked quite a lot of oil. At first, I suspected the usual weak points, the speedometer drive seal and the rear main seal, but after close inspection, I found a hairline crack in the rear casing. My first thought was to have it welded, but that opened the door to quite a few other issues like warping. So I found a spare push-down reverse transmission and used the rear casing from that one instead. It was super greasy and dirty and oily, but after a quick wash with some benzene and a little bit of magic in the bead blaster, it turned out looking pretty good. Now that the rear casing was clean and looking up to scratch with the rest of the transmission, I could press in a new main transmission mounting into the bottom of the rear casing and add a new rear main oil seal. While I had this apart, I also swapped out all three reversing gears and touched up the fifth and reverse selector fork. The reversing gears in this transmission weren't in such great shape, and I had recently bought some second-hand gears that were in far better condition. I figured it would just be easier to swap out a few parts now than to get the car running and realize it jumped out of reverse. With that job done and all the gears working exactly how they should, I installed the new rear casing and then bolted the bell housing back in place. And that's the last of the work on the transmission for this car. So between all the work on the engine block and the pistons and now getting that transmission really sorted, I'm fairly confident that I can start the assembly process of this engine and get this engine and transmission back into the car and get it fired up, which we all know is long, long overdue. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing it together. So I hope this little update video answered some questions and cleared up some issues from that last video about this engine. And I really look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. The next one's going to be the build of this engine, which I'm really looking forward to. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.